Hey, this is Patrick Sullivan. Welcome to my shop. I made a breakthrough discovery this past year. If you spend hours in your shop, bend over your work, your back will ultimately complain. When the complaints from my back became loud enough, I decided to try to change the way I work. Like many woodworkers, the work surfaces in my shop are about the same height as kitchen counters. That is about 34 to 36 inches, or about 85 to 90 centimeters. This worked well for early 20th century housewives who needed to chop, cut, and stir to make dinner. However, if you're not 5'2" and you are not baking a cake, but are working with small components, this height might result in big league back strain. A 6-foot person will typically lean forward between 60 and 70 degrees from the vertical, forcing the back muscles to hold up to a third of your weight. Something like holding a bowling ball out at arm's length for an hour. It's at least tiring, if not painful. Raising the work surface can make a huge difference. After some trial and error, I found that increasing the surface height by about 8 inches transformed the way I work. I was standing much more erect, and I could see my marks and cut lines more clearly. I'm 6 feet tall, and I made the bench top 8 inches above the 35-inch height of my work table. For me, this seems to be a good height for sharpening, light planing, gluing, carving, light chisel work, and most assembly tasks. My strong advice to you is to test different heights to find out what works for you. Make a quick and dirty plywood box out of scrap wood held together with a few screws, or even a heavy cardboard box, and test out the proposed height. Mock up some of the tasks you'll want to do, and see if the height feels comfortable or awkward. It's easy to raise it up a little with blocks of wood or books, and if it seems too tall, take it apart and cut it down. You'll save yourself a lot of effort in the long run. I just used an old plywood box at first, but it was so successful that I decided to make a small workbench to replace the box. Let me show you what resulted. Although I considered just making a bigger and better plywood box, which by the way I think would work reasonably well, I opted to make something heavier, more versatile, and better looking. I started with a single 10-foot board of 6/4 hard maple, planed it flat, squared up the edges, and cut the pieces to length. Then I glued 2 pieces together to form a bench top that's 27.5 inches long and 16 inches wide. After removing some cupping, it was 1.3 inches thick. Please note that this kind of joint is as strong as the wood itself, and adding splines, biscuits, or dowels does not add any strength. My original plan was to make simple leg assemblies that did not span the full width of the top. The reason was I wanted to leave 1.5 inches of free edge all around the bench for clamping purposes. I changed my ideas on this later, and I'll explain why in a few moments. The legs attach to horizontal runners, or aprons, with screws, but no glue. I wanted to be able to disassemble the bench later. The screws are big number 14s, almost 1/4 of an inch thick, and they're plenty strong for the job. I added feet to the front legs to give me an easy way to clamp the bench to my work table. I cut a very shallow rabbet in the front legs to help keep the feet square and level without rocking. Feet are attached with number 10 stainless screws. Once I had the leg assemblies together, I turned the top over and laid out the locations for the legs and the vise. I set the legs in 1.5 inches from all the edges to allow this free edge for clamping purposes. However, as I'll explain later, the legs should be flush with the front edge. Each leg assembly is attached to the top with 2 lag bolts. The holes in the runners are slightly oversized to allow a little seasonal wood movement between the top and the runners, which run across the grain of the top. Once I had the leg assembly oriented correctly, I put the drill bit in the holes and tapped them to make a centering mark. I then moved the leg assembly out of the way and drilled slightly smaller holes that were sized to allow the lag bolt threads to bite in solidly. I wanted a good vise, similar to the vise on my large woodworking bench. I ordered a model by Yost that's probably a little oversized for the job. I cut the 2 jaws for the vise out of the same board that supplied the wood for the rest of the bench. I marked the location of the holes for the guide rods and the threaded rod on the back side of the inner jaw. I then taped the 2 jaws together and drilled slightly oversized holes through both jaws. Once the holes were drilled, I cut a shallow rabbet in the top of the inner jaw to help align it with the bench. I agonized about recessing the inner jaw into the tabletop, and in the end, I decided not to. In retrospect, that was a mistake, and I'll explain why in a moment. Disassemble the vise and lay the mounting plate on the underside of the top in its exact position. It butts up against the back of the inner jaw. I clamp the jaw in position first, and then clamp the mounting plate to the jaw. This locks everything up tight. Then mark the position of the bolts that anchor it. I used a drill bit that exactly fit the holes in the iron mounting plate, and I just drilled a little bit to make a centering mark in the wood. Then I used a smaller drill bit that would allow the 1/4 inch lag bolt threads to bite into the maple solidly. The back jaw is screwed into the bench top with 4 stainless steel finish screws. The holes in the jaw must align with the holes in the cast iron mounting plate accurately. Get this right. The jaw is solidly supported by the mounting plate and the top, so these screws do not have to contend with large clamping forces. The vise comes without a handle. The hole for the handle is 9/10 of an inch. So a 7/8 inch dowel would be a slightly loose but reasonable fit. However, I didn't have a dowel of that size, so I turned one to fit out of maple. With tenons on the ends to fit one of my Forstner bits. I then turned 2 knobs for the ends out of mahogany. I kept the shape fairly cylindrical to make it easier to clamp, align, and drill the holes for the shaft. I drilled mortises in the knobs to fit the tenons on the ends of the shaft. One knob gets permanently attached with 5-minute epoxy. The other knob must be attached after the handle is installed in the vise. It's a snug fit, and then I drilled a hole all the way through the shaft for a thin finish screw that locks the knob to the tenon. Obviously, this could be removed later on if the need arises. I assembled the mini bench and planed the vise jaws flush with the top. This is also the right time to plane the top dead flat. I then chamfered all the sharp edges with a block plane. I quickly realized that this design was highly stable when forces were applied on the back and sides, but the extra weight and lever arm caused by the vise made the bench a little tippy if I put a lot of weight or force on the front jaw of the vise. I corrected this problem by extending one of the front legs out flush to the front edge of the top. This completely resolved my stability issue. In retrospect, I would extend both leg assemblies out to the front edge. Had I recessed the back jaw of the vise into the top, I would have increased the stability of the bench even more. I wiped on a polyurethane oil product to the vise handle, mainly because I like the color it produces on the mahogany. I then applied 2 coats of acrylic varnish to seal the maple. A lot of workbenches are left unfinished, in part to keep them from becoming slippery. However, I really liked the appearance of this mini bench, and I knew that I would quickly get the surface dirty and stained and spotted with glue. So I was not trying to turn this bench into a piece of furniture with a glossy finish. I just wanted to seal the wood very well for protection. After the varnish dried, I sanded lightly with 320 grit. Although I intended to clamp the mini bench to my work table, I discovered that it had sufficient mass and stability to allow me to work with it unclamped much of the time. To reduce any remaining tendency for it to slide across my work table, I glued neoprene to the bottoms of the feet. This worked beautifully. I got the neoprene by buying a cheap mouse pad online. You can cut strips to size with either a utility knife or scissors. Glue the fabric side to the feet with rubber cement. These non-slip feet have worked so well that I rarely have to clamp the bench to the work table. The soft feet would also be a good solution for someone without a shop who wanted to put the mini bench on a kitchen table or a countertop. They also make it possible to set the bench on top of a table saw. Now, regardless of whether this is a good idea, many people with small shops use their saw table as a work surface. Using the mini bench this way is much better than working directly over the saw blade on a metal surface. Most traditional workbenches with a front vise also have holes for bench dogs. These make it possible to clamp pieces that are much larger than the capacity of the vise. People who are making full-size furniture find these very convenient for hand planing large components. However, this mini bench was not designed for big jobs. It was designed for smaller projects, and my vise has plenty of capacity for the kind of work I've been doing on it, so I elected to skip the dog holes. Some people who make mini benches put the vise on the end so that they can hold long pieces like table legs. I don't do a lot of furniture anymore, and I'm much more comfortable working directly in front of the vise, so I located mine on the long side, as you can see. Let me show you some of the ways I use this mini bench. First, I made a simple device for sharpening. It's just a small piece of 1/2-inch MDF with a strip glued on the back for the vise to grip. It's covered with a foam rubber shelf lining material that I bought at Home Depot. The liner is smooth on one side, but grippy, and it keeps my diamond sharpening plates firmly in place wherever I want them, regardless of their dimensions. I cut most of my very small parts by hand using a Japanese dovetail saw, and then I trim the surfaces with a plane as needed. I have 2 small jigs that make that kind of work fast and accurate. The first is a modification of a traditional bench hook. It fits into my front vise. I can cut with my pull saw by putting the work on the far side of the fence and lining up my saw with the edge of the jig. I can then trim or straighten the edge by laying the piece on the front side of the fence and planing the edge with my plane on its side running in this slot along the side. The track for the plane is large enough for my full-sized plane if I need it. I have an auxiliary fence for this planing jig that creates an accurate 45-degree surface. Using this, I can plane small miters very easily and cleanly. I also have an ultra-simple mini miter box type of jig. All I did was glue 2 pieces of hardwood together. and drop it in the vise. I cut a 90-degree and two 45-degree cuts in it with my Japanese pull saw, using a couple of guide blocks that I cut on my table saw. Now I can make very accurate cuts on pieces so small I would never dream of putting them on my table saw. My bench weighs almost 38 pounds, or 17 kilos. I can easily lift it, but it's heavy enough that you immediately notice its heft. This weight adds to stability, but if you're going to need to move this frequently during the day, you might think about whether this much weight will get to be a chore. The vise itself, without jaws, weighs about 11 pounds, so it's almost 1/3 of the total weight. I think the vise could be smaller, with a weight savings of perhaps several pounds. You could also use a lighter weight wood than maple, such as poplar, and you could reduce the size of the top. My vise does not have a quick release. So far, I don't regret this decision. The threaded rod has a pitch of 4 threads per inch, so just a few spins of the handle will open the jaws for most tasks. For the occasional task where I need the jaws wide open, I can accept the extra few seconds. However, this is a very personal decision. Think about it. I've been using my mini bench for a few months now, and I love it. I'm kicking myself for not building it sooner. I think it's a great choice for a wide range of needs. If you like this video and you want to see more, click on my picture in the upper right corner to subscribe. If you want to see some of my videos about making small chisels and carving tools, click on the link at the right. If you want to learn more about making carbide tools, a brilliant idea by the way, click on the link at the left. Thanks for watching.